Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is how the international diplomatic landscape is changing. One of the best examples is the newly created bond between Israel and Greece. Greece and Israel are advancing a series of important defense and other agreements. Those agreements include weapons, training, and services. The agreement was approved by the Greek Parliament's Standing Committee on National Defense and Foreign Affairs on Wednesday, July 2nd, 2020. National Defense Minister Nikos Papadopoulos explained it this way, I'm quoting, "The strategic relationship between Greece and Israel is a major priority for our country, mainly due to the common challenges, but also the common interests that unite the two countries. We believe that cooperation with Israel strengthens a pillar of stability in the Eastern Mediterranean." Unquote. As the agreement was reached, Greece's Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis had a telephone conversation with U.S. Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey. Menendez is a leading member of the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. More than that, the New Jersey senator is a strong critic of Turkey. Menendez has been critical of Turkey because Turkey has wandered out of the sphere of U.S. influence and into the waiting and eager arms of Russia and the Iranians. Greece and Turkey have a long and ugly history of tension. For many years, Israel chose to advance their relations with Turkey and their contacts with Turkey simply to placate the Greeks, though. They also did some things in order to advance that relationship. And whenever Israel's relationship with Greece seemed to be warming, Turkey would grumble and express their displeasure. Over the past 5 years, however, that balance has shifted almost totally. Relations between Israel and Turkey have cooled, and Greek-Israeli relations have blossomed. Israel is not alone on this. The same relationship and shift in relationship is mirrored in the present-day relations between the United States and Greece and the United States and Turkey. Historically, the numbers and numerically, it's important to see what goes on here. Greece only has a population of about 10 million people. It's relatively small, while Turkey has 84 million people. Also, Israel and the United States saw Turkey as a foothold into the Muslim world. They were hoping that Turkey would be the perfect springboard into economic opportunities and normalization with the rest of the Muslim world. There is good reason for the shifting of relationships and agreements. Economics plays only a small role. More important is that over these past few years, Turkey has turned into an irresponsible party in the region. Get that. Turkey has become irresponsible. They have consistently lashed out at the West, especially at the United States and Israel. Turkey has been siding with arch enemies of the West, especially Russia and Iran. Greeks and Turks have been involved in 4 major wars in the modern period, and I'm going back beyond before the modern period. The modern period, of course, dates back to hundreds of years of these modern tensions when the Greeks achieved independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1830. The island country of Cyprus has become a classic example of the fallout of tensions between these two countries, Greece and Turkey, beginning in the 1950s and continuing to the very day. Both Greece and Turkey claim Cyprus as their own. As a result, Cyprus is divided. There is a split in the island. The city of Nicosia is divided, complete with a concrete wall, armed soldiers. Part Greek, part Turkish, Nicosia resembles Berlin of old. For Israel, tensions between Turkey and Greece are an opportunity, and Greece is very happy to be a partner with Jewish state, especially because it comes at the expense of Turkey. Israel wanted to repair their relationship with Turkey, but Turkish leadership, especially the Turkish President Erdogan, has been reluctant and recalcitrant. Erdogan has been leading his country down the path that embraces ever more Islamic ideals and has become ever more anti-Western in its rhetoric. Given Erdogan's character, there is little chance for change. And so now the United States and Israel are searching for ways to punish Turkey because of Turkish arrogance and anti-Western behavior. The nature of foreign relations is that those who subscribe to shared principles are rewarded. Those who do not are punished. It is a carrot and a stick phenomenon of foreign relations. It's important to get a sense of that. Greece is on a roll. This agreement between Israel and Greece is a sign of the future. Greece will be rewarded with further expansions and economic adventure, and Turkey will be pushed further and further to the sidelines of the West. Like everyone else, I've also been thinking about racism. It's inevitable. I can't not. It's all over the place. Racism has become one of the most used terms in our modern vernacular. The world has been divided into two. Either you're a racist or you're a person who calls other people racists. Unfortunately, as often as the term is used, most people are completely unaware of its true meaning. And I think the truth would surprise them. The science of racism emerged hand in hand with the rise of nationalism. It was a form of anti-Semitism. You heard me correctly. Racism began as a form of anti-Semitism. It began because ardent nationalists needed to justify their jingoism. Jingoism is an extreme patriotism and nationalism tinged with an aggressive foreign policy. And in the 1880s, nationalism was raging. Today, we would say that it was nationalism on steroids. There was a need to try to express and give form, term, to define what they really meant, to differentiate between insiders and outsiders. Insiders were part of the Volk, V-O-L-K, pronounced folk with an F in German. The Volk was a people linked by land, blood, and culture. If you were an insider, folk, you were superior to others simply because you were who you were. You were great, and you were greater than others because you shared common land, blood, and culture. If you were not part of the folk, you were inferior. It's as simple as that, very straightforward. It's an easy equation. The most used proof for accuracy to prove the folk versus non-folk theory was a pseudoscience that emerged at the very same time, called eugenics. Eugenics used measurements and body shapes, eye color, forehead shape, nose shape to evaluate the superiority of one race over other races. While many people associate eugenics with Nazi Germany, it existed before Hitler came to power, and the term was coined in 1883 actually by Francis Galton, who wanted to improve humanity by having only the most healthy people have children. That is to pair healthy people with healthy people. That is exactly what Hitler did in terms of pairing Aryans with Aryans. In fact, eugenics was promoted in major American universities, before Hitler and after Hitler. People relied on this bunk as evidence to prove that they were better. That's why it's called pseudoscience. It was in the context that it was in this context that anti-Semitism emerged as a word, an unidentifiable tool of the racists. Wilhelm Marr, that was his name, coined the term anti-Semite in 1879 in order to describe a positive belief that it was good to be a racist and an anti-Semite. Why? Because anti-Semites, racists, nationalists were protecting Germany from the invasion of the outsider. You get the point here. The outsider. And who was the outsider? The Jew. The Jew was actually lived in Germany for centuries, spoke German, but did not have German blood, hence the distinction. German culture, yes, right? Lived in Germany, land, connection, the whole thing, but not German blood. Other than the Jew, there were really no groups of outsiders in Europe, just the Jew. And that's how racism emerged, to the dismay, by the way, of certain Europeans. After the prolonged period of emancipation, during which Jews in Europe received rights and equal citizenship, Jews became major players in the society. And that was what the anti-Semites and the racists were upset about. At the same time that Wilhelm Marr was doing it in Germany and coining his phrase anti-Semitism, a character named Edward Dromont was echoing the exact same doctrine in France. Both men and their followers believed that if allowed, Jews would take over the national culture and the society of their countries. It would no longer be German or French culture. It would be German Jewish, French Jewish culture. And that's where the problem was. Racists and nationalists and anti-Semites were synonymous terms. They were interchangeable. And to be one was to wear the badge of pride, you have to realize. It was a badge of pride. To be called one was to be paid a compliment in the philosophy of the racists and the anti-Semites. The racists used these terms as pseudoscience and the pseudoscience behind the terms to elevate their ideas. They did not want to be considered Jew haters. Those were people who focused on theological hatred of the Jew. They were not at all interested in the church's view of the Jew, which was about the deicide, deicide, D-E-I-C-I-D-E, the belief that the Jews murdered their God. Their hatred of the Jew was nationalist ideology, not religious. Adolf Hitler and his call to elect Germans as the master race was based on these ideas. He was creating an Aryan race, not just to promote the race's superiority to rid Germany and then the world of the subhuman race, in his eyes, the Jews. Racists believed that Jews would contaminate the pure Aryan blood and race. When Hitler's first rise to power, and this is important, when he first started his political campaign to office in the 1920s, Jewish intermarriage in Germany, that is, Jews marrying Germans in Germany, was over 50%, 50. In the United States at the same time, intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews was virtually unheard of in the 1920s. Virtually unheard of. Over the past few months, we have seen a rise of Jew hatred and attacks against Jews and against Jewish institutions. It's simply called anti-Semitism. Today, the word racism seems to be exclusively reserved for anti-Black behavior. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from the Providence Journal. That's Providence, Rhode Island. One of their local columnists, Matthew Mangino, writes a column. He's a regularist, called the Mangino column. I think it's weekly, actually. This one is titled, The Term Nazi is Misused and Overused. You get to see a theme I'm developing here in today's show. It was published on July 3rd, 2020, and addresses the subject that I've written about and spoken about numerous times, and I've even spoken to you about on this show several times. This is how Mangino begins. Longtime Houston prosecutor Kathleen Williford recently resigned after posting a meme on Facebook that appeared to equate Nazis with people who have participated in protests of racial justice. Williford, who was head of the trial division at the Harris County, Texas District Attorney's Office, posted the meme that showed a black and white photograph of a wooden box full of wedding bands that were removed from Holocaust victims. A caption above the photo reads, in part, each ring represents a destroyed family. Never forget. Nazis tore down statues, banned free speech, blamed economic hardships on one group of people, instituted gun control. Sound familiar? The Nazis also started World War II, killed 6 million Jews during the Holocaust, and were responsible for widespread looting, plunder, and countless atrocities. Mangino was correct in that so often we just use the word Nazi and throw it around as if it's simply a word. It is not simply a word. Mangino goes on to explain what the Nazis did in order to show us today that the person you disagree with is simply someone you disagree with, not a Nazi. Nazis created, and this is how he writes it, Nazis created a series of concentration camps where Jews and other undesirables would be delivered by cattle cars to face extermination. Men, women, and children would be ushered into death houses after they were stripped of their belongings, i.e. their jewelry, in Wilford's meme, stripped naked and gassed. Their bodies incinerated in large ovens. Throughout the remainder of the war, Jews in the countries occupied by Germany were deported by the thousands to death camps, places like Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz began to operate with ruthless Nazi efficiency. The killing continued until the last months of the war. The liberation of camps, as the Nazis retreated, revealed the horrors that are still etched in the collective memory of the human race. unquote. Mangino concludes with an admonition to those who misuse the word Nazi. And he says it very clearly in order to try to prove something which is important. Just don't use the word. It's not appropriate. And this is what he says. For those who feel like attaching the label Nazi to some group they oppose or a person or figure they disagree with, think twice. Nazi is an abhorrent term reserved for the vilest organization in the history of the world. Your political opponent is not a Nazi. The protesters down the street are not Nazis. The police are not Nazis. With few exceptions, none of us have ever had to face a Nazi in the 75 years since the end of World War II. And for this, we should be grateful. There's no question that Matthew Mangino is absolutely correct here. Next up is a similar concept, only about cartoons, something else that we deal with all the time on the show. It's a column by Michael Kavanagh. And Michael Kavanagh actually is not a columnist. He's actually a cartoonist. And this column was written about a cartoon that upset a lot of people. Who better to write about the subject than a cartoonist? It was published on July 3rd, 2020 in the Washington Post and is entitled, How a Newspaper Cartoon with a Swastika-Wearing Trump Roiled a Florida Community. The cartoon appeared in the Islander News in Key Biscayne, Florida. It's a very small paper. A swastika was only partially viewable, and yes, the Nazi symbol was on President Trump, as he was saying, "Chuck the Constitution." This is how Kavanagh begins. He describes the entire episode. Small newspapers in some southern and Midwestern states have recently issued a cluster of apologies, explanations, and resignations over controversial cartoons, commenting on protests and police brutality. At the Weekly Islander News in Key Biscayne, Florida, however, leadership has stood by its decision to run a hot-button cartoon while running numerous letters over the past several weeks to let its tight-knit community air their views on why the artwork was so incendiary. The June 11th cartoon, created by veteran contributing cartoonist Peter Evans, depicts President Trump saying, "Chuck the Constitution." The caption puts Trump urging to dominate and arrest and try Black Lives Matter protesters in opposition to the First Amendment's protection for peaceful assembly. To try to drive home his point, Evans drew a partially obscured swastika on Trump's suit jacket. Now, I've got to explain here. There were so many letters that were sent into the editor about this. It was really fascinating. But one of them, and this is me, not Kavanagh speaking here, one of them actually very clearly articulated the issue. It was written on June 18th by a woman named Caroline. This is what she writes. That the swastika, quote, is a representation of the greatest evil that modern history has witnessed. And it is an atrocity that has a direct impact on so many of our lives. The use of a swastika as a symbol for everything dictatorial, even fascistic, greatly diminishes the true scale of evil that Nazism represented, even when compared with other dictatorial and fascistic regimes, unquote. This debate will go on and on. The idea of free speech and free press is powerful and important, but I would add that these freedoms come with responsibility to both history and language. Unfortunately, too many people do not cherish the freedom or the responsibility. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 3 cartoons today. First up is a cartoon by Michael Ramirez. We've used him a lot. He's one of the best political cartoonists in the world today, certainly in English. And it was published in Town Hall magazine on July 5th, 2020. The cartoon has the Capitol, that's with an O, right? Capitol building in the background, and a platform where a statue was once standing. Only the shoes remain. 2 protesters are speaking to each other, and 2 adult tourists are nearby where the statue once stood. Protester 1 says to protester 2, who's holding a sign that reads, "Destroy History," says, "That was a statue of an abolitionist." The second asks, "What's an abolitionist?" The tourist says to his wife, "Maybe we should be defunding public education." That's funny. It's funny because it's gotten to an extreme point here where they don't even understand the terms. No, that's what they're fighting for. Next up is a cartoon by Marian Kaminsky, and it's from Austria and was published on June 24th, 2020. It's a play on Russian President Putin, who just had the Russian parliament extend his presidency. It's almost as if he's president for life, Putin. Putin is throwing away the key to history. The history book is actually in chains with a lock on it. He's throwing the key away, and he totally controls it. He controls everything. And on the wall, Russia is scratched out and is renamed Putinistan. Putinistan from Putin. Again, very, very funny. The final cartoon is about self-destruction and the self-destruction of the New York Times. And we spoke about this last week, and it's important to just get a sense of it. The cartoon is drawn by Rainer Hirschfeld in Germany. The New York Times is depicted as a person, stabbing, shooting, and hanging itself. The cartoon is focusing on the removal of the editorial page editor, James Bennett, who dared publish an op-ed piece by a Republican senator. Now, the New York Times is a very important journal, there's no question about it. And it has made a lot of mistakes. Its coverage of Israel is very questionable. However, to remove an entire piece or to say something is not kosher simply because it's from the side of the other end of the aisle is deeply problematic. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. Iran has been experiencing a series of explosions. Over the past few weeks, we have watched numerous electrical stations explode, a hospital go dark, and now a fire and explosion at Natanz, the secret Iranian nuke site just north of Tehran, Iran's capital. Now, in Iran, and it's important to get a sense of what's going on here, all fingers are pointing at Israel for engineering a computer hack that caused these mishaps. It makes sense, obviously. In other words, it was the computers that caused the problems. Israel set in motion a computer hack which enabled them to do this. But Israeli Defense Minister, and actually in rotation, future Prime Minister Benny Gantz, has said that all the mysterious events that have been happening in Iran are, quote, not necessarily the work of Israel. Iranians are also looking at local sabotage as an option. Yeah, this may all be a smokescreen. Israel is almost certainly responsible for the breakdown of the Iranian nuclear facility and the electrical facilities, an attack that set Iran's nuclear program back probably at least a year, if not more. Israel has said that they will never let Iran attain a nuke. The downside of these counterattacks, and you should know that this is the biggest problem in all computer attacks, assuming that we're perpetrated by Israel, which I think they are, or we can just assume that they are, is that Iran will discover Israel's secret cyber techniques. Every time they attack, Iran can then not just stop the attack, after they prevent the attack, after they're able to defend themselves, that attack cannot be used again. Also, they are teaching Iran their methods, because by defending against that attack, Israel now has given them a tool not just to defend, but also to attack. And that's dangerous. So Israel has to be very careful of the way in which they attack Iran. Leaders of Russia, Turkey, and Syria have joined together for video conferencing in order to discuss Syria. They're all invested in Syria, and they all have troops in Syria, and they all have weapons in Syria. And they all, by the way, are petrified of what Israel is doing in Syria. They all want parts of Syria as it divides up, and they all want to make sure that Bashar Assad maintains power there. This is the second time the group is meeting, and it's important to get a sense of it. These leaders have important matters to discuss, and they are creating rules so that they don't cross paths. Because if they do, there would be terrible results if Russia, Iran, and Turkey's military forces or air forces hit one another. The summit had very large implications for the region. It is very important for the stability and security of the region that Russia put the brakes on Iran and Turkey and their expansion in Syria itself. Jew haters will never let facts get in the way of their hatred of Jews. The canard that Israel taught American police, the chokehold that killed George Floyd, is just another cruel example, another lie. However, and this is probably not a shock to you, but it should be known. In 1983, the United States Supreme Court ruled that city police may use the chokehold. The Supreme Court in the United States. The court case began as a result of the 1976 arrest of a person named Adolph Lyons in LA. He was arrested for a minor violation of a broken taillight. Lyons did not resist. However, he was put in a chokehold. He passed out. He survived, and he sued the city of Los Angeles. The case made its way all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the ruling came against him by a vote of 5-4. Thurgood Marshall, the first black U.S. Supreme Court justice, wrote the minority opinion, which he identified the problem. This is what he wrote. For many years, it has been the official policy of the city to permit police officers to employ chokeholds in a variety of situations where they face no threat of violence. Now, this is a big deal. The essential point is that Marshall was identifying a problem in 1983. He was explaining that chokeholds were in place at least since the 1970s. And you should know that the Supreme Court, despite Marshall's powerful and prophetic minority opinion, upheld the chokehold. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that Friedrich Nietzsche wrote an essay called The Use and Abuse of History? I reread it several times a year and often speak about it. He understood that people abuse history all the time. I cannot think of a better example than the misuse of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is used and abused constantly, and unfortunately, the more it's abused, the less value it has. We live in a world of hyperbole, a world where exaggeration is vogue, and honestly, where you shout louder and exaggerate more in order to make your point. We hear it all the time, calling a person you disagree with lazy speech and lazy thought. You should not be using the word Nazi or abusing the Holocaust this way. The Nazis created murder machines that never were before created in order to murder millions of Jews. They created crematoria in order to murder millions of Jews, in order to dispose of the Jewish bodies because they had no space to bury them. They could only murder as fast as they could dispose the bodies. That is a very high bar, and the democratic political dispute is nowhere close to that level of inhumanity. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.